first became interested in the lives of John and Horace Dodge when I was hired to write a history of the Dodge main factory in Hamtramck on the eve of its demolition back in 1980. I discovered as I started to do research that there'd been very little written about the Dodges, despite the fact that the Chrysler archives and even the Ford archives had quite a lot of information, particularly about their business, Dodge Brothers. I put off doing much about this project because I got sidetracked by writing 4 other books, including Riding the Roller Coaster, my history of the Chrysler Corporation, just published 2 years ago. Now, it's true that in the meantime, Jean Patrone published her book, The Dodges, and Caroline Latham and David Agresta published their book, The Dodge Dynasty, but neither book really focused on John and Horace Dodge's work in the automobile industry. Both books are very incomplete and frankly not very carefully researched. I'm going to talk tonight about John and Horace Dodge, their life, their contributions to Detroit society and to the automobile industry. John and Horace Dodge had distinct interests. By the way, I can only give you a brief summary tonight. To learn more of all the fascinating stories, you will read which will be available after the lecture at a substantial discount out in the front. And it's also available for in fine bookstores everywhere. I'll take cash or checks. I'm not set up to deal with credit cards. Get that out of the way. Because John and Horace were partners in work and in play for their entire lives, their life experiences were so intertwined that I really cannot discuss either of them individually. I need to discuss them as a team. Let me get this on. There they are. There's a swat.
I'm going to lower the camera, but I'm sorry.
Or raise it a bit. Raise it higher. Yeah, raise the whole thing a bit.
All the way up.
Yeah, it actually can go up to the top. There. There they are, the two brothers, as mature men. Their corporate logo that they adopted shows very clearly their interconnection and interdependence. There's the corporate logo, and I have to say right in advance, the Dodge brothers were not Jewish. This symbol is in fact not really a Star of David, but rather an ancient symbol sometimes called Solomon's seal that was used in Hindu, Jewish, and Islamic cultures. The two intertwined triangles and the interconnection of the D and B embody their utter dependence on each other. This symbol, Solomon's seal, has stood for the mystical union and dichotomy between conflicting forces like the body and the soul, the physical and the spiritual, earth and heaven. And in the case of the Dodge brothers, the union of the two brothers into one functional entity. It happens to not be a coincidence that they adopted this symbol in part because the Greek letter delta is a triangle. So you have two deltas intertwined on the corporate logo. Let me say a little bit about their background. The Dodge brothers and their sister were all born in Niles, Michigan, in southwestern part of the state. John Francis Dodge, the older of the two brothers, was born in 1864, and Horace Elgin Dodge was born in 1868. They were two of three children born to Daniel Rugg, with 2 G's, Dodge, and Maria Casto Dodge. They had an older sister who actually was born with the given name of of Della. Her name was Della, but that was too common for her, so she changed it to the more fancy Delphine, more refined Delphine. Della Dodge was 1 year older than John. Their father, Daniel Dodge, worked for his brother Caleb, who operated a foundry and machine shop in Niles, which made railroad standpipes. These are, in effect, water towers for the railroads. These were steam-powered railroads operating back then. At various points, John Dodge claimed that the two brothers grew up in poverty in Niles, going barefoot even in the winter months. This is a lot of nonsense. A lot of men who want to show that that their lives embody a rags to riches story have to prove they were in rags at some point. Most of them did this. Don't believe the things Henry Ford says about his childhood, or Lee Iacocca, or most of the rest. They make up a lot of stuff to make themselves look better. Why is it a lot of nonsense? Well, first of all, their father was a skilled machinist, a skilled craftsman who earned a fairly decent pay. They owned their own little house in Niles. It wasn't elaborate, but they were homeowners. And the telltale indication is that Della Dodge and John Dodge both graduated from high school back in the 1880s. And Horace would have, except they left town while he was still in school and he never went back. In the 1880s, graduating from high school was a major accomplishment. It was almost the equivalent of going to college today. And if you were from a poor family, you did not get the luxury of staying out of the workforce until you were 18 or 19 years old. When you turned about 14, you went to work in a factory or somewhere else. They were not poor. They were respectable, maybe lower middle class or middle class family. While growing up in Niles, Horace had a fairly painful childhood. He was teased unmercifully by his peers over his first name, Horace. And for a long time, Horace called himself Elgin, Deli, H.E., and other variants until well into adulthood. Finally, when he became a multimillionaire and people really couldn't poke fun at him, he started using Horace again, and then named his first son Horace Elgin Dodge, Jr. Horace and John both showed their mechanical talents early in life. In 1881, when Horace was 13 and John was about 17, they built a working high-wheel bicycle out in Niles from scrap materials they picked up around town. Horace also learned to play the piano as a youngster, and I might add, he saved up enough money to buy himself a violin when he was about 12 years old. This was not a Stradivarius, but clearly a child of poverty wouldn't have the money to buy himself a violin to learn to play. He also learned to play the piano as a youngster, and of the two brothers, it really is Horace that had great musical interests. He learned to play the piano because, oops, I want to go forward. I'm not getting any action there. The technology has failed. I'll carry on for a bit. Horace was befriended by...
Charlie, could you shut it off accidentally? It's off.
All right, let me...
It's the button, bottom button.
Okay, it's now on?
There we go, we're on. There we go.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm not getting anywhere, though.
That is a very interesting picture, Charlie.
Well, let me continue, and then hopefully we get this fixed. He was befriended by a very wealthy Niles man named Joseph Tuttle, who supposedly was the richest man in town, and had an elaborate home which included a piano in the living room. He encouraged Horace to sort of come into his house and learn to play the piano on that machine. John and Horace's parents and uncles spent all of their lives in Niles and eventually were all buried at the local cemetery there. Daniel Dodge left Battle Creek with his children he left Niles in 1882 and moved to Battle Creek after the deaths of his two brothers. They stayed in Battle Creek for only 2 years and then moved on to Port Huron in 1884. 2 years later, John and Horace then moved to Detroit. There we go. I promise not to mess it up again.
Sorry.
This is the mother of John and Horace Dodge. This is Maria Casto Dodge. This, by the way, is one of about 40 pictures that appear in my book that have never been published before anywhere. This was in the archives of Meadowbrook Hall. This is the home of Mr. Tuttle. Again, certainly a prosperous man in the 70s in Niles. This was on the main street. The house, unfortunately, is gone. And the Dodge tombstones in Silverbrook Cemetery. They had one large generic headstone and little headstones for each of the family members. And there's the Casto or Casto one as well. Leave you in the cemetery for a moment. After John and Horace Dodge moved to Detroit in 1886, they went to work initially for the Murphy Boiler Works, which manufactured marine boilers. This was on the Detroit riverfront. There they gained valuable experience working with Thomas Murphy, who was a noted Detroit marine engineer and manufacturer. Now I should point out that all throughout their lives, they really were gaining experience and training as machinists. This was the trade they were following in the footsteps of their father and their two uncles. In 1894, the two brothers took jobs as machinists for the Dominion Typograph Company across the river in Windsor. They lived in Detroit and commuted back and forth to work every day. Horace Dodge invented and patented an improved bicycle ball bearing. And the brothers then formed a partnership with Fred Evans to produce the Evans and Dodge bicycle. And there you see an ad for it. It was commonly called the E&D. It also was sometimes called the Maple Leaf bicycle because there was a maple leaf on the bicycle itself. They manufactured those bicycles from 1897 until 1900. And the patent that was issued to both brothers, but this is the only time I know on joint documents that Horace Dodge's name came first. The patent was issued to Horace Dodge and then to John Dodge secondarily. Normally, John, because he was older, would always appear first on any listing. Well, in 1900, the Dodge brothers dissolved their Canadian venture. They sold it out to a Canadian bicycle maker. And they received about $10,000 as their share in the business. Well, in 1900, $10,000 is really a good amount of money. They returned to Detroit and in 1900 started their own machine shop known simply as, their own business known simply as Dodge Brothers. They started it in rented space in the Boydell building, which is still standing on Beaubien and Lafayette in Detroit. They started there with only 12 employees, and they were down in the basement level. One interesting thing about this location is that they occupied space just vacated by one David Buick, who was making automobile engines in that basement. So that's a remarkably important historic building in terms of Detroit's early auto industry. And fortunately, the Greektown casino people have stopped their plans to demolish that for a parking lot. And that's another view. It's the home of Mickey's Greek Pizza and all of that. for the first year or two, the first year and a half that they owned their own business, they manufactured various kinds of machinery and parts for other manufacturers. But in early 1901, they became major suppliers for the Detroit automobile industry. Initially building engines for Ransom Olds to power his popular curved dash Oldsmobile, the so-called Merry Oldsmobile. In June of 1901, Olds gave the Dodge brothers a contract to build 2,000 engines. And the following year, an additional contract for 3,000 transmissions, which made the Dodge brothers, by 1902, the largest parts supplier to the automobile industry in Michigan, and I think anywhere in the country. Because they had these contracts and needed to expand, they moved into a brand new 3-story, there's young mustachioed Horace Dodge, right after the turn of the century. I'll come back to him a bit later. They built and moved into a brand new machine shop not far away, located at the corner of Hastings Street and Monroe Avenue in early 1902. This building, and I'll show you a better view in a minute. By the way, get out my little magic pointer here, make sure I don't point it in my face or knock out my eyes. This is Monroe Avenue here, where you see the streetcar line, and this is Hastings. This whole area right now is taken up by the Walter Chrysler Expressway and the access roads to that. So this is, and of course, the Walter Chrysler Freeway basically took out pretty much all of Hastings Street at once. That's an interior view of that machine shop, taken, I think, in 1903. They remained at that property until 1910, when they opened up their new plant in Hamtramck. Again, this is Monroe Avenue with the streetcar running on it, and this would be Hastings. This is a much better picture of that very dark building I showed you in the previous slide. And this basically was a machine shop, and then they built foundry facilities here and here. But they quickly outgrew this location once they started working for Henry Ford. Now, early in their career, the Dodge brothers followed a basic division of labor in their work, which continued throughout their entire lives. John Dodge negotiated contracts with outside customers and suppliers. He took care of the firm's finances, advertising, and the dealer relations once they produced their own car. John Dodge always served as the outside man who sort of dealt with the outside world. Horace, on the other hand, managed the factory. He designed the products that they were making, and often the machinery used in manufacturing as well. So he was clearly the inside man. I think Horace was happy just to spend his days in the factory, getting his hands dirty with machinery and so forth. John had a real flair for deal making and for finance, while Horace was a mechanical genius. A perfect partnership, really, in most respects. Their skills and interests were complementary, not conflicting, and not overlapping. Two wonderful caricatures appeared in the local newspapers of John and Horace Dodge. These both dated from 1905, and there you see John Dodge. At the time, he was a water commissioner for the city of Detroit, so he literally sat on the water board. Here he is sitting on the hydrant. And obviously using a precision device, a hammer and chisel to work on this mechanism there. The Sambo figure, of course, would not be politically correct today, advertising special machinery construction while you wait. Horace Dodge, drawn by a different caricaturist at about the same time, with his trademark mustache, his cap, and he apparently is running as quickly as he can to keep up with that gear, wherever that's going. I should add that while the two brothers had complementary skills and worked together very well, they insisted that they not be addressed on any business matter as individuals. Mail coming to the Dodge Brothers business had to be addressed Dodge Brothers and the address. If a letter came addressed to their business address, to either John or Horace individually, it was returned to the sender with the note undeliverable, address unknown. And they insisted on this throughout their working life. Now, of course, their personal mail would go to their homes, and that was different. The Dodge Brothers' fortunes changed permanently and definitely for the good in late 1902. Henry Ford, at that time, was about to launch the Ford Motor Company. It was in the planning stages. This was his third automobile company, and he was planning a new car, the Model A. He approached the Dodge Brothers about becoming his major parts supplier, major supplier of the components he was going to need. At that time, in late 1902, the Dodge Brothers had about 150 employees in their shops, and their operation was considered at the time to be the best machine shop in Detroit in terms of the precision and quality of the work that they were getting out. In February of 1903, the Dodges did agree to supply Ford with an initial supply of 650 chassis, sometimes called the machine, or the machines. The chassis consisted of the frame, the engine, the transmission, the drive shaft, the axles, virtually the entire car other than the body and the tires and wheels. Henry Ford in 1903, and for the first couple of years of his operations with Ford Motor Company, was primarily simply an assembler of parts and components made by others. When he opened up his first factory, so-called factory on Mack Avenue, Henry Ford employed 10 boys and 1 machinist, 1 mechanic. At that time, the Dodge Brothers employed almost 400 men. Now, because Henry Ford was constantly, and I should add that the first Ford cars were really Dodge Brothers cars. They happened to have somebody else's body put on them. And all the blueprints and drawings for those cars were kept at the Dodge Brothers shop, not at the Henry Ford little assembly building. Because Henry Ford was constantly short of cash during the first 6 months of his operations and was always falling behind his bills that he owed the Dodge Brothers, the Dodges agreed to accept 10% of Ford Motor Company stock in lieu of $10,000 that he owed them. From that point on, the Dodge Brothers worked exclusively for Henry Ford until 1914 when they introduced their own automobile. They also remained major stockholders in the Ford Motor Company until 1919, and they were an independent force who were not shy to disagree with Henry Ford when proposals came forward. And they remained stockholders until Ford bought them out in 1919. So the fate of Henry Ford and the Dodge Brothers were closely intertwined. This is a picture of the Ford Board of Directors in 1911, and you can see here's John Dodge, Horace Dodge, Henry Ford, of course, in the middle, James Couzens, Horace Rackham, David Gray, who was a banker, and John Anderson, who was Ford's lawyer and also an investor. Well, as Ford kept expanding, particularly with the introduction of the Model T, the Dodge Brothers were really pressed to keep up with his demands for components from their old factory on Monroe Street. They began working on building their own factory in Hamtramck. This was literally at the same time. This is the Ford Highland Park plant. which opened in January 1910. The Dodge plant went into operation in November of that same year. This is the main assembly plant under construction at Highland Park sometime in 1909. And the Ford Highland Park plant as it looked at its greatest peak. This is Woodward Avenue running here. This office building is still standing, although has been neglected and abandoned for decades. I've been told that the floors in that building are green with moss. It looks like someone's put a green carpet in there. Unfortunately, the powerhouse, this office building, and all of the buildings in this area here are gone. And they are now the home of the Model T Plaza, that strip mall out there in Highland Park. And looking at the Highland Park plant, I did learn an interesting factoid about Henry Ford. I always thought he was, the cheapest, most skinflint man in terms of spending money. I discovered that only 4 of these 5 smokestacks on the powerhouse are actually connected to anything. He wanted to put the F-O-R-D letters in large script, and so he needed a 5th smokestack, which doesn't connect to anything. It's sitting there for looks. I kept seeing pictures of this powerhouse operating, and there was never any smoke coming out of this last stack. And then I figured out why. It was a luxurious waste of money to satisfy his ego and get his name out there. Anyways, once Ford opened up the Park plant, the Dodges simply had to do something, and they bought a 60-acre parcel in rural Hamtramck and began constructing their factory, which became known to all of us as Dodge Maine. The first set of buildings were designed by Albert Kahn. Right on the other side of this fence is Joseph Campo Avenue running north and south. This is their original small office building, and I'll show you a picture of that later, but it was more than 3 times that size. Their original powerhouse with Dodge Brothers on the stack, and then their early machine shops and a couple of other buildings in the back. And let me go on to the next one. The Dodge Maine plant continued to be one of the largest factories, certainly never quite as big as Highland Park, in Detroit in the 19-teens and 20s. Well, the Dodges, I should point out, employed about 5,000 men at that Hamtramck plant while they were still only making parts for Ford. By 1913, they were producing annually about 250,000 of the following components for Ford for the Model T. 250,000 transmissions, drive shafts, rear axles, front axles, and crankshafts, along with other parts. According to one estimate, between 1903 and the end of 1913, the Dodge brothers manufactured 60% of the total value of all Ford automobiles made during that 10-year period. So these were very important guys as suppliers. I would argue that they contributed in a substantial way to the success of Henry Ford and also Ransom Olds earlier. They served as his main part suppliers and also an independent voice on the Ford board of directors. It's also true that their relationship with Ford allowed them to become very wealthy men, allowed them to launch their own automobile, and provided them with an enormous amount of wealth. When the Dodges introduced their own car in 1914, and this is the first car they manufactured in November of that year, they resigned from the board of directors of the Ford Motor Company, but they held on to their stock. Henry Ford refused to pay dividends to the Ford Motor Company stockholders starting in 1915, and the Dodges led a lawsuit against Henry Ford, which eventually forced Ford to pay past dividends in 1918 when the case was finally settled. Henry Ford, of course, wanted complete control of Ford Motor Company, and in 1919, he bought out the other stockholders, including the Dodge brothers. He gave the Dodge, or paid the Dodge brothers $25 million cash for their 10% share of the Ford Motor Company. A small piece of change back then. The Dodge brothers had also earned about $5.5 million in dividends from their Ford stock since 1903, and an additional profits of probably $2 million from their contracts with Ford. So their original investment of $10,000 in Ford Motor Company in 1903 yielded a total return of $32 million. Not a bad outcome. The story is told, which sounds like it ought to be true. When John Dodge received his check from Ford for $12.5 million, he tried to cash it at the bar at the Detroit Athletic Club. As a joke, of course. And the bartender said, "I can't really do that, Mr. Dodge. I don't have that much money in tills." Anyways, in November of 1914, the Dodge brothers introduced their own nameplate. They did that in part because they wanted to produce a car on their own. They thought they could make a much better car than the Model T. And they wanted to become independent from Henry Ford. They were afraid that Henry Ford would simply cut them off at some point, and then they would be stuck with a factory but nothing to produce. So they introduced, in late 1914, a mid-priced, extremely well-designed, well-built car, known for its reliability. The first copy was called Old Betsy, and this photograph is taken in front of John Dodge's mansion on Boston Boulevard, which is still standing. And there's John and Horace in the back seat, and their chauffeur stopping for the photographer to record this event. Horace Dodge was responsible for much of the design of this first automobile. And at least part of that design work was done in a cottage up at the Meadowbrook Estate, Meadowbrook Farms up in Rochester. The two brothers spent a lot of weekends up there when they were working on this car. It is said, although I have no firm documentation, that they tested early prototypes of this car by driving them into a wall. The driver would get out before the crash happened. They'd get the car up to about 30 miles an hour and see how it did. Early crash tests, but they were no dummies. They didn't stay in the car. They also supposedly tested various brands of tires by dropping them off an 8-story building and see how they did. It's a monument to the Dodge brothers' reputation as quality manufacturers that 13,000 businessmen asked to become Dodge brothers dealers before they ever saw a single Dodge brothers car. They didn't know what it was going to look like. There were rumors that it might be a 6-cylinder car or a 4-cylinder car. But 13,000 dealers, including quite a few Ford dealers, signed up, put down a deposit, and wanted to become Dodge dealers. The new car was a great success. The first full year of production was in 1915 when they produced 45,000 cars. By 1920, their production reached 145,000. In the late teens, the Dodge brothers were generally the 4th or 5th largest automobile producer in the United States. Ford, of course, was number 1, way ahead of everybody else. And normally Buick and Chevrolet were either 2 and 3 or 3 and 2. And then the Dodges were 4th, Dodge brothers. This is an early ad for their car. They launched a very interesting tease ad starting in July of 1914, which you can all read about in my book and mine. For the first 6 months, they only manufactured this touring car model. There were no windows that rolled up. This was basically an open car with a roof on it. You didn't drive this thing around in the winter unless you were dressed very warmly. After about 6 months, they introduced this two-seater, and then began to introduce a whole series of other models. Their car developed a wonderful reputation, and they got a lot of free publicity when General Pershing decided to buy 50 Dodge automobiles to use in 1916 in the American campaign against Pancho Villa in Mexico. And he ordered these cars for his staff to use, his officers, and they found that the Dodge cars, even in the desert of Mexico, were far more reliable than other cars, and certainly better than horses or donkeys. And this is just a classic picture of one of these Dodge cars. A young, dashing colonel named George Patton led a raid on one of the Mexican revolutionaries' headquarters with a series of about 10 Dodge touring cars, and he put a bunch of soldiers in them, and they snuck up on this headquarters with a surprise raid, and it was a great success. Dodge Brothers also provided virtually all of the ambulances used by the United States Army during the First World War. And I should add that when Pershing then went to head up the American Expeditionary Force in France after we entered World War II, he used Dodge Brothers cars exclusively. He ordered that no other cars be supplied to his officers as other than Dodge Brothers because of their reputation. You could shoot at them, you could shoot out the tires, but they just kept going. One interesting product that the Dodge Brothers made during the Second World War is not automotive at all. They were asked by the U.S. government to manufacture some very precise recoil mechanisms for two French artillery pieces. And these artillery pieces, the recoil mechanisms, I should say, had been made by hand, very labor-intensive process in France in several dozen factories. Horace Dodge devised a whole set of machines to produce these mechanically, sort of mass production. And once they were up and running, the Dodge factory, which was near Dodge, Maine, produced more of these recoil mechanisms for two particular models than all the factories in France. This is the 135 millimeter Filot general purpose gun. That was one of the models that they did recoil mechanisms for. And this is the 135 millimeter, referring to the size of the shot that it shot, 135 millimeter Schneider howitzer. One of these Schneider howitzers can still be seen parked right outside of the Parkside Homes housing project on the east side of Detroit, just south of Chandler Park. And what you see here is Connor Avenue, and Warren is the cross street, and this is the Connor Warren Shopping Center. Unfortunately, some of Detroit's criminals pried off the bronze plaque that explained what this was. So it's now sitting there with no explanation. This was actually erected as a monument to the Parkside Project men who died in World War II. They found this, and it had a perfectly good plaque explaining what it was. I've been tempted to sneak here in the middle of the night and take this, rescue this, and put it in my backyard as an outside sculpture or something. But I won't do it.
If we take it any place, take it down to Fort Wayne. Now, we have another one down at Fort Wayne, but it's been modernized with the rubber tires.
Okay, but in any case, yeah, this was one of their very important projects, and they worked on these recoil mechanisms virtually for no profit. Sadly, the Dodge Brothers were dead by November of 1921, but in November of 1921, as part of the American Armistice Day celebration, Field Marshal Foch from the French Army came to Detroit to honor the Dodge Brothers Company and its contributions to the French war effort during World War I. This is the enlarged office building. It's now 4 stories tall and was quite a bit longer. And I apologize for the quality of the slide, but you can see there are both American flags and French tricolor flags interspersed. And this was the only American manufacturer that the French recognized at this time. Now, the Dodge plant continued to expand while the Dodge brothers were alive and then after their deaths as well. This is what the plant looked like in the early 1960s, and this is pretty much what it looked like when I studied it on the eve of its destruction. This is Joseph Campo running north and south. This is that office building with some sort of ugly looking awnings added to it. The original powerhouse is right out of sight here, and these are those original buildings that showed up in the 1914 slide, and then all the other stuff that was added with it. This, of course, now is all entirely gone. At its peak, I should point out, the Hamtramck factory included about 6 million square feet of factory space, of workspace. By 1920, the Dodge plant employed 20,000 men and women. Moving to the more somber topic of the death of the Dodge brothers. In January 1920, John and Horace Dodge attended the National Automobile Show in New York City, and both contracted influenza. There had been several worldwide flu epidemics that had been going around the world, very deadly ones. They both contracted the flu. Horace then began to recover, but John's condition got worse. He had suffered earlier in his life with tuberculosis, which had damaged his lungs. John Dodge died on January 14th at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel with Horace at his side, still feeling very sick. John Dodge was 55 years old, clearly dying well before his time. His body was taken to Detroit. Public viewing of his body and the funeral took place at his Boston Boulevard home, with burial in the Dodge Mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery. And here you see a shot of the mausoleum. The brothers decided to spend their eternity side by side, much like they had spent their earthly life. This contains the remains of John and Horace Dodge and quite a few of their family members. And follow this Egyptian theme. There's an embarrassing picture someone took of me riding one of these sphinxes like Pointe, but I'm not going to show you that today. This mausoleum, this is the beautiful stained glass window on the inside with pyramids, palm trees, and sand, continuing the Egyptian theme. And again, some of the symbolism of the pharaohs. As far as I know, they, meaning I suspect the wives, simply following the popularity of all things Egyptian in the early part of the 20th century. There were a lot of archaeological discoveries made, and so they went with this theme. I've never seen any written explanation of how exactly this came to pass. Neither Horace Dodge nor John's widow, Matilda Dodge, could attend the funeral because they were both too sick, still suffering from the flu. Horace, who was still in New York, ordered that John's coffin not be sealed until he had a chance to see his brother once again. And he didn't do that until March. At the time of John Dodge's death, the Detroit Free Press made the following observation. This community can ill afford to lose John Dodge. He was a citizen who counted. He was one of the big forces in the making of modern Detroit, and there's every reason to believe that if he had lived the next 10-year period, would have been the time of his greatest accomplishment. Well, to add to the tragedy, Horace Dodge did not survive the rest of 1920 either. He was chronically ill and weak from recurring bouts of the flu, plus he was psychologically devastated by John's death. He really lost any interest in the business. He almost never went to the factory, and in fact spent most of the rest of 1920 at his Palm Beach, Florida estate, hoping that the warm climate there would help in his recovery. He became very withdrawn, melancholy, and basically stayed down in Florida. Horace Dodge died in Florida on December 10th, 1920, at the young age of 52. Now, his body also was returned to Detroit. His funeral was held at his Rose Terrace mansion with none other than the entire Detroit Symphony Orchestra playing a funeral dirge. The Presbyterian minister who delivered the eulogy described Horace Dodge as, quote, a man with a passion for music, a mechanic with the soul of a poet. Now, I want to add just a couple of quick comments on what happened to the Dodge Brothers Company, and I do talk about this in the book. Following Horace Dodge's death, the factory closed briefly, but then a man that both Dodge brothers had sort of handpicked to succeed them, a man named Frederick Haynes, became the president of Dodge Brothers. None of the children of John and Horace Dodge were either interested in taking over the business or particularly capable of doing so. The Dodge widows, Anna Thompson Dodge and Matilda Rausch Dodge, held on to the company until May of 1925, when they sold the business to the New York investment firm of Dillon Reed and Company for a cool $146 million in cash. Each of the widows got $73 million in cash as a little nest egg. And again, remember, in 1920, that's real money. That would probably be the equivalent of $1.5 billion or $2 billion today. Dillon Reed did not run Dodge Brothers very successfully in terms of products and in terms of profits. So when Walter P. Chrysler approached Dillon Reed in 1928 and offered to buy Dodge Brothers, the bankers jumped at the opportunity. Chrysler acquired Dodge on May 19th, 1928 for $170 million in stock of the Chrysler Corporation. He paid no cash. He basically issued new Chrysler Corporation stock, and that was how he did the purchase. Now, I want to conclude my presentation today by getting to some of the good stuff and sharing with you some glimpses of the personality of these two brothers. And I want to talk about their non-automotive activities, including their charitable works. Horace Dodge, who was the mechanical genius, was easily the more quiet, shy, and sensitive of the two brothers. He did enjoy the trappings of wealth, and I suspect his wife enjoyed the trappings of wealth even more. He began really showing his prosperity to the world by building the original Rose Terrace mansion here in Grosse Pointe, designed by Albert Kahn, and it was completed in 1910. After Horace was gone, his widow, Anna Thompson Dodge, I know not very beloved by many of you, eventually tore down that house because it wasn't fancy enough or elegant enough for her, and she built the house you are more familiar with. I call it Rose Terrace number 2, which was completed in 1934. She died in 1970, and this house was then demolished in 1976. Horace Dodge's two abiding interests in life, other than machinery and cars, were powerboats and music. And this is the powerboat Lotus, which Horace designed and Horace and John built in 1900. This was supposedly the fastest speedboat on the Great Lakes when it went into operation. Horace and John then jointly owned a series of luxurious yachts, including the Nokomis and the Delphine, which you are probably most familiar with, was actually not launched until 1921 after the two brothers were dead, but they had planned the construction of that. Horace's other interest was in music, which went back to his childhood in Niles and continued through his entire life. Horace was in fact initially attracted to Anna Thompson. We married in 1896 because she was a far more accomplished pianist than he was. She in fact had formal music training, taught piano lessons, and so forth. When Horace built, back up here, when he built Grosse Terrace #1, he had an enormous pipe organ installed in the house, which he played for some of his closest personal friends. I also learned from my research that his big pipe organ in Grosse Terrace could be set up as a player piano. He ordered rolls of music, which would go on a player piano kind of device and could play without anybody actually hitting the keyboards. More importantly, Horace Dodge became one of the most active promoters of the fledgling Detroit Symphony Orchestra in the early 20th century. He, first of all, helped finance the search for a permanent conductor in 1918, a man named Osip Gavrilovich. I never could get that. And more importantly, he led the campaign to raise funds to build Orchestra Hall, which opened in 1919. That's a remarkable story in itself. Between the time of the groundbreaking and the actual opening of the building for the first symphony, a mere 5 months passed. Anyways, Horace personally contributed $100,000 for Orchestra Hall. A little more than $1 million was needed, but he then convinced his fellow automakers to make substantial donations as well. In appreciation, the Detroit Symphony Orchestra played at the wedding reception for Horace Dodge's daughter Delphine, which was held in June of 1920, and again they played at Horace's funeral. After Horace Dodge's death, Victor Herbert, I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit. Yeah, Victor Herbert composed the Dodge Brothers March, dedicated to Horace Dodge in appreciation of his efforts toward the advancement of American music. I have an audio tape of that march, which I've played many, many times. It sounds an awful lot like a John Philip Sousa march to me, but I'm not an expert on these things. John Dodge, in contrast, was far more outgoing, fun-loving, and I might say aggressive than Horace. He was very quick-tempered and often prone to violence. Most of the stories that you've read and heard about the Dodge brothers going out and drinking excessively and then getting into fights and smashing up bars, those fights were generally initiated by John Dodge, but of course Horace went along with everything John did. They sort of drank together and got in some trouble together. Typically, they would then come back the next day when they were sober, apologize to the owner, and pay for all the damages they had done. The Detroit Times published an article at one point criticizing John Dodge and some of his political allies. John Dodge was having dinner at the Detroit Athletic Club. He saw the article, left his dinner behind, drove to the editor's house, a man named James Schermerhorn, knocked on his door, and when Schermerhorn came out, he punched him in the jaw and in the nose and told him that if he ever criticized him or his friends again, he'd come back and really beat the crap out of them. I'm sure he used even more colorful terms than that. John Dodge also did enjoy the trappings of his newfound wealth. First of all, he built an elaborate home on Boston Boulevard in Detroit in 1906. It cost $250,000 and was designed by the firm of Smith, Hinchman and Grills. And by the way, Smith, Hinchman and Grills then designed all of the remaining John and Matilda Dodge homes, including Meadowbrook. This was Matilda Dodge's home from their marriage in 1907 until John Dodge's death in 1920. Today it is owned by the Archdiocese of Detroit, and Cardinal Maida lives there. I've often said that if I were to win one of those multi-state, multi-million-dollar lotteries, I would approach the Archdiocese and offer them so much money for this house that they couldn't refuse, and I could move into it. I've been told from my spies that the house is almost entirely unchanged from when it opened up in 1906. There have been some modifications made to the kitchen, which happens. But the rest of the house is just as it was when John and Matilda lived there. Now, at about the same time that John Dodge built the Boston Boulevard home, he then purchased a large farm in Rochester, Michigan as a country retreat and renamed it Meadowbrook Farm. It was a horse farm at the time, and I guess Matilda had a great interest in horses even then. Meadowbrook Hall, of course, was built much later in 1929. Now, at the time of his death, John Dodge was building an enormous new residence or mansion in Grosse Pointe. And here is that house under construction. It was located a little bit to the northeast of Rose Terrace and was on Lake Shore Drive. This was also designed by Smith, Hinchman and Grills. It was never completed. After John's death, Matilda said she just did not have the strength or the heart to finish the house, and she certainly did not want to live in it. This was John Dodge's dream. And the house sat vacant. I think there were some legal problems with the house for a little while. It was finally demolished in 1941. And some pieces of this house and some pieces of the Boston Boulevard house did end up out at Meadowbrook, incorporated in some of the rooms out there. John Dodge, unlike his brother, was outgoing and got interested in politics. He was a powerful figure in Detroit and Michigan Republican politics in the 1910s. He was friends with Robert Oakman, who was a real estate agent, and Mayor Oscar Marks. And many of his Republican friends wanted John Dodge to run for the U.S. Senate, but he refused to do that. It would have been interesting if he had run in the same race where Henry Ford ran for Senate. John Dodge did, however, serve on the Detroit Board of Water Commissioners from 1905 through 1910, and is credited with expanding Detroit's water system in a very efficient, timely fashion. He then served on the Detroit Street Railway Commission starting in 1913. He also made six-figure charitable contributions to various Detroit charities, including the Detroit Federation of Women's Clubs, the Salvation Army, and the YMCA/YWCA. He donated to his church, or I should say Matilda's church, the first Presbyterian in Detroit. It's interesting that the two brothers did everything together except they went to different churches. The Horace Dodges were members of the Jefferson Avenue Presbyterian Church, close to Grosse Pointe. Anyway, they did not attend the same churches. The Dodge legacy, unfortunately, is not very well known these days. There are no schools named after the Dodge brothers. There are no freeways. After their deaths, the Dodge Brothers Company did donate land to create a series of parks, 12 parks it was, mainly in Oakland and Macomb County, and I think there was one out in Washtenaw and Only 3 of those named parks still exist. Oh, sorry, I forgot to show you that. This is a picture of one of the enormous trees, adult, mature trees that John Dodge had transferred from somewhere else for that house that was never completed. And look at the size of the root ball. that they picked up. Well, when you're a multimillionaire, you can do this kind of stuff. Not worry about it. And of course, Meadowbrook Hall is where eventually some of John Dodge's work ended up going. There is a marker recently installed in Niles, Michigan, near the boyhood home of John and Horace Dodge. Unfortunately, this marker was based almost entirely on the Agresta book, The Dodge Dynasty, which means it's full of mistakes. If you own a copy of The Dodge Dynasty, I would suggest you use it either to start your fireplace, fire starter, or possibly use it as a doorstop. Parts of it are sheer fiction made up from I don't know where. Maybe he was taking drugs or something while he was writing. So this sounds good. And this. That is still standing. 3 of the parks have survived. This one is in the city of Sterling Heights. And irony of ironies, it's supported by the Ford Motor Company. It's terribly impersonal. These parks were simply called Dodge Park Number 4, Dodge Park Number 5, Dodge Park Number 6. This one is out in Oakland County, and this is in Commerce Township, which I think is also Oakland County. Dodge Park Number 5. There is, of course, the Dodge Fountain down at the riverfront, donated by the Dodge family in memory of Horace Sr. and Jr., but unfortunately, whatever plaque was down there that commemorated the connection with the Dodges seems to be gone. I spent a good hour looking high and low all over Hart Plaza, and I couldn't find any marker. So, and of course, it doesn't work most of the time anyways. The Dodge brothers were certainly deserved to be considered one of the dozen or so most important early American pioneers in the auto industry in Michigan in the 20th century. They helped launch the automobile careers of Ransom Olds and, more importantly, that of Henry Ford. Their own nameplate is certainly one of the most distinguished in the American automobile industry. Most of all, I think the lives of John and Horace Dodge throw a good deal of light on the early Detroit automobile industry and on early Detroit. I'm going to end there. Thank you for your attention. If we can have the lights up, I will. I will gladly take questions on any topic that I've talked about and on any topic I haven't talked about.
Berman?
Yes, sir.
There's an interesting fact about the Dodge Main plant. That was the only, I think it's the only plant in the world that had 2 assembly lines running side by side right through the whole plant. 2 assembly lines. Crank out a couple thousand cars a shift.
Yeah, they were, once they ran what I call twin models. One was the Plymouth Volare and the Dodge Aspen, and they were running, but they weren't side by side for much of the time. They went up on different floors. That plant did not work very well towards the end of its life. Some of those cars were delivered to dealers with Aspen trim on one side of the car and Volare trim on the other side. I am not making that up. That is true.
Can you mention about how General Motors tried to buy the company from the Widows? The reason why that didn't happen?
Well, when the Widows put the company on the market in early 1925, they actually had 3 or 4 different serious bids. The reason they took the bid from Dillon Reed is it was in cash. And General Motors was going to offer some cash and some bonds, which didn't carry any interest. And the 2 widows were no dummies when it came to business. Had they lived today, they probably would have been running the business as the CEO. But that, of course, was a different era. No, they were both sharp as tacks when it came to business matters, probably Matilda more so than Anna Thompson Dodge. But no, the offer was in cash. And I should add, part of that $146 million valuation included a sum of $50 million for goodwill. It had nothing to do with the physical assets of the Dodge brothers. They said the goodwill of the Dodge brothers' name is worth $50 million by itself. Dodge brothers had always carried goodwill on the balance sheet at $1, I think. Something like that. Yes, Lee?
The epilogue of Pershing thinking that Dodge found his Ponteria is Ponteria must have been impressed because it was a Dodge car that it was his when he was shot up. But certainly,
Yes. They really were, they had a reputation for being sort of overbuilt in every sense, just extremely reliable. And in fact, they were called dependable for a long time, and at some point they started using the term dependability in some of their advertising. That was a word that was not in the dictionary at that point, and Mr. Webster, or the Webster Company, then adopted that as a new term to add to the dictionary. It had not really existed. Dependable had been around, but not dependability. Yes, David?
Would you care to tell us what the Dodge brothers did the day after they attended Ford's wedding?
Oh.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, they launched their lawsuit against Henry Ford over stock dividend payments the day after they attended Eleanor Clay Ford's wedding. Well, they didn't want to embarrass him. Once all of that business was done, I should add, there was no long-standing enmity between Henry Ford and the Dodge brothers. The story is told that Henry Ford was on a train traveling somewhere when he received word of John Dodge's death, and he was visibly shaken and was quite, remarkably different from the rest of that trip. So yes, they had business disagreements and conflicts, but I think there was a basic respect going in both directions between Ford and the Dodge brothers. They've been partners, after all, for 10 very important years in the Ford Motor Company's history.
John Dodge was vice president of the company?
Yeah, John Dodge was vice president, and so forth. Yes, sir.
My father always told me that the reason why they got the Army ordered the Dodge vehicles is because they were so dependable, because they had a 12-volt ignition system while the entire industry had 6 volts.
Yeah, I think that is probably true.
Yeah, it is true, yes, it is.
Yeah, I had not heard that precise explanation of it, but that makes sense.
I had read that the reason that Ford didn't pay dividends to any of the stockholders at that time is because he wanted all the money to build his Rouge plant.
Yes, absolutely true.
And another point, maybe a Grosse Pointer can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe when you drive down Lakeshore and you cross Grosse, the parcel of land that sits in the lake that has a big boat well, slip in it, I should say. The land across Lakeshore
Right.
was where the mansion
Was where that
Harbor Hills.
Harbor Hills. Yeah, because supposedly they were going to have a tunnel going under Lakeshore. So they had,
There is one.
yeah, no, that's true. But I forgot your earlier point.
About the fact that the dividends were not paid so that
Oh, yes.
Ford could build the Rouge plant.
Yeah, and Ford also said, look, none of you stockholders are doing any work that deserves payment of dividends. So you're not going to get any except for some very minor ones. And clearly he was going to pump all the money into the Rouge, and it wasn't clear they were ever going to get dividends. He just wanted to expand. But ultimately he bought them out, and then he could do what he wanted. Yes, in the back?
Were the Dodge parts ever used for production or any special purpose? Or the sites where the Dodge parts are now?
No, they were, this I think actually was land the company bought after the deaths of the two brothers. And They were intended simply to be recreational areas and a monument to the brothers. They both liked the outdoors, despite being associated with the factory. They both loved to leave town and spend the weekends at the Meadowbrook Farms. And they both hunted. Both of them would go up north to a hunting lodge, and shoot up a bunch of deer and then come back to work. In fact, there's one marvelous story that Horace was up north hunting, and he got word that the DSO was playing one of his favorite symphonies. And he said, I have to hear that. So he chartered a special train, had himself brought back to Detroit, and went into the symphony hall in his hunting clothes and sat in the back row. He, of course, had his own box, but he sat in the back row, listened to the symphony, and then left and got back on the train and went back up north. This was a man who loved music.
Are there members of the Dodge family still alive?
Yes, in fact, there's several in this room. I don't know if they want to identify themselves or not.
Yeah.
But yeah, there are quite a few in this area, and I understand there are still some in Florida. Still down there in New York.
I know that you mentioned the fact that the brothers insisted on being addressed as Dodge Brothers Company.
Right.
As late as 1948, 49, 20 years after it had been owned by Chrysler, if you called the Hamtramck plant, the switchboard operator would answer Dodge Brothers.
Ah, interesting. Yeah, the nameplate was gradually phased out in the early 30s by the Chrysler Corporation. But Walter Chrysler actually wanted to anoint the Dodge division with the Dodge Brothers name and really emphasize it for quite a long time. They had stamped, the intertwined D and B got stamped on a lot of parts and components, and people bought Dodge vehicles years and years later and found components with that stamp, the D and B letters together. Yes?
In one of the Dodge biographies that you have mentioned, it's alleged that Henry Ford had John Dodge murdered. What do you think of that?
That is utter nonsense. That's another reason why that book should be a fire starter. I address that actually specifically. I take Agresta and Latham to task multiple times in my book. I'm sure they're not going to go out and buy a copy of it if they're still around. David Agresta, by the way, his only claim to be able to write a Dodge book is he's a collector of some Dodge memorabilia, and he knew one or two members of the Dodge family. He's an actor. That's what he does for a living. But to add, make that your comment, no, there's absolutely no evidence of that. The doctor that treated John Dodge and Horace both at the Ritz-Carlton Hotel said, they died from the flu. That's very clear. They had all the symptoms, and John Dodge had a weak lung from his bout with tuberculosis. And there's no evidence that they were poisoned. The question is, why would Henry Ford want to poison them anyways? It's not like the Dodge automobile was competing with the Model T. They were two different price ranges. And I think Henry Ford had made peace with them. Once he bought them out and they were out of his hair, it was not, there was no reason for it. And it's simply unlike Ford anyways.
There's a statement in Bernard Baruch's autobiography, My Own Story, in which he says that he was out with John Dodge in New York the day before he got sick, and that John had invited him upstairs to have some bootleg gin, bathtub gin, and Bernard Baruch refused, and he said that he felt that John Dodge was contaminated or weakened or, if not killed, by this?
I talk about that as well. First of all, he claimed that he thought John Dodge had been poisoned at some dinner that he had attended at the convention. If you were John and Horace Dodge in 1920, you did not lack for the finest Canadian and European liquor of any sort that you wanted, and you consumed it out in public. You did not drink bootleg booze or bathtub booze. I think that's just a preposterous notion. We know, particularly from living conveniently on the Detroit River, as Horace Dodge did, there was no lack of speedboats to run bootleg liquor back and forth across the border. And of course, you have the Hiram Walker facility right across there producing very nice whiskey. I don't believe that for a minute, but I do talk about that as well in the chapter on their deaths. Yes.
Do they produce their own Dodge motorboats?
No. The Dodge motorboat business was the work of Horace Dodge Jr. He produced for several years, I don't know very much about that business, but he produced motorboats that I think were fairly popular.
There's actually quite a fine book on it now, too. I've got this here, but everybody wants to look at Horace Jr.
I don't think the business was ever very successful, because I think he kept coming back to Anna Thompson Dodge asking for money to help pay his next payroll, and he finally dropped out of that. Yet John Dodge's son, John Duval Dodge, also did announce plans to build a car that he was going to call the Dodge Sun, but as far as I know, that was never built. He never got the funding to do it. Yes?
Is your book being sold at the Chrysler Museum in Auburn Hills?
Yes, it is. And in fact, my Chrysler history, called Riding the Roller Coaster, until 2 months ago had been banned in Auburn Hills at the Walter Chrysler Museum because I spoke the truth about the so-called merger of equals. Apparently, now that the Kerkorian lawsuit is pretty much settled, their lawyers are going to allow my book, which speaks the truth, to be sold. I was threatening to park my car right outside the Daimler Chrysler property with my trunk open and a big sign, banned in Auburn Hills, buy it here. Yes, it is being sold there and in fine bookstores everywhere.
Great, well, thank you all very much for coming.